Hi, Dr. Van. This is Tom Payne again, and we're going to continue our discussion about how to get better at selection. And as I'd introduced Fan before, he and I founded a company about 3 or 4 years ago called Talent Assessments International to help companies figure out how to get better at selection. We develop personality tests and cognitive ability tests and job analysis questionnaires to help people focus on exactly the right things. And so, exactly the right things. One of the things we've been talking about ever since we began is that even though we've made a lot of progress with the validity of personality tests and cognitive ability, and fans been doing a lot of research with AI and how we can use that, but we still come back to the most important thing that anybody can do in terms of the selection process is to focus on the structured interview, which we're going to continue to talk about today. And when we talk about the structured interview implies automatically that we have certain competencies that we've identified through the job analysis process that give us the roadmap of the questions that we're going to be asking candidates. And then we're going to be evaluating the candidates' past experience and development of those competencies in their past lives and how relevant that is to the job that we want them to do if in fact we decide to bring them on board. So Dr. Fan, thanks again for joining with me. It's always good to have these discussions. People should know that. Thank you. Well, Fan and I talk to each other a couple of times a week, usually, anyway. So um, we're very much engaged in this topic. So let me start with you and ask you. In a previous episode, we talked a little bit about the most recent research that's been published by Paul Sackett at the University of Minnesota on structured interviews. And if you wouldn't mind just kind of reiterating or talking a bit about what that research showed in terms of what really contributes to a valid selection decision.
Okay. Uh, in the past few decades, actually, it goes back to 100 years ago. Scholars have developed many different selection methods, such
Right.
as cognitive ability test, personality test, uh, work sample test, assessment centers, situation judgment test. That makes people wonder, well, among all these selection methods, which one is most effective in predicting future performance?
Correct.
So Hunter Schmidt did a couple of meta-analysis trying to summarize this literature. They come with a list. I believe, if I recollect correctly, on their list on the top is cognitive ability test.
Right.
But the problem with cognitive ability test is it creates huge society issues because there's a huge IQ scoring difference between different ethnic groups, particularly between white and black. The mean score difference is usually as large as one standard deviation. That's a very large effect. So it creates lots of societal issues, lawsuit that makes organization pause. They don't like to use cognitive ability tests, and that's why in the last few decades, personality tests become very popular because personality test does not suffer the same problem. But
Correct.
anyway, in a recent JEP paper published in last year, Paul Sackett and colleague point out some methodological limitations or weaknesses of Hunter Schmidt's previous meta-analysis, and they tried to fix those methodological issues and basically updated the meta-analysis. Well, they come up with slightly different list. This time on top of the list is structured interviews because they find based on meta-analysis, structured interviews has highest validity. In other words, structured interviews are most effective among various different of selection methods in predicting future performance. Though that's the main message that paper tries to convey.
Right. So, which brings us back to the discussion on how do you use competencies in terms of the selection process. And as I've alluded to, we design interview guides that are created coming out of the job analysis questionnaire results. So we advise clients to make sure you understand, get people who are job content experts, people who are intimately familiar with the job, and those are people who are supervising the job and people who are doing the job very well. And so you ask those people, what is it that you do that leads to success, and how often do you have to do that? And so, based on the scoring that comes out of that job analysis process, we hone in on 6, 8, or 10 key competencies, and from there, that's what we make as our target for the structured interview. So the structured interview is primarily designed around our interest and pursuit of finding out how the candidates have evolved or developed these competencies that we know are relevant to their success on the job. So that's our approach to the structured interview. Job analysis questionnaires are very helpful, but then we get into identifying the structured interview guides, which are built around the competencies. So let's talk a little bit about the interview guides themselves and how they can help interviewers. And I know you've done some research with your graduate students on identifying the types of questions that are useful in conducting the structured interview.
Okay. If you remember from the previous episode, I introduced the basic procedures of job analysis / competency
Right.
models. So at the end of it, we have competency models. The competency model have two components. Number one, it includes anywhere between 6 to 10 key competencies for a target position, and under
Right.
each competency, a bunch of representative positive and negative behaviors indicative of that competency. And that's our starting point to develop interview question bank. So for each competency we identified, we usually come up with somewhere between 5 to 10 interview questions addressing each of these competencies, and that's called interview question bank. Then
Right.
we try to use these interview question banks. We try to interview a bunch of people. Most of them are excellent performers, mixed with average performers. We ask these kind of questions. We record the interview scripts and try to analyze it and come up with some kind of scoring method. So for each interview question or each type of interview question, what kind of response will score 5? What kind of responses were scored 4, 3, so on and so forth, using BARS, behavior anchored reading skills. Therefore, we know how to score interview responses, and we put these things together. That makes the interview guide. So this is the document all the trained interviewers will bring to the on-site interviews, because they know they can refer to which competencies they want to ask questions about and which questions they want to ask based on the response of candidates, how they should score on those interview questions. That's pretty much summarize the basic process.
Yeah, that's good, helpful summary. The other thing, of course, that we do is we usually recommend that you involve at least 3 different interviewers in the structured interview process, and that those interviews should be one-on-one interviews, not have 3 or 4 people firing questions at a single candidate, sometimes called a panel interview. We find that those things are not very reliable, and they don't yield the kind of results that you get out of the one-on-one interview. With the other thing, though, is that when we use that, and you mentioned this interview question bank, we give each of the interviewers a different question on a competency. So, for instance, if there's a competency called initiative, we would not assign the same initiative questions to every interviewer because that would be repetitious. So we find with using the interview guide bank of questions, we're able to design interview guides that have different questions that get at the same competency so that 2 interviewers can both query the candidate about initiative, but in different ways, so they get better information. And of course, as you mentioned, the behavioral anchored rating scale, or bars, is enormously useful because that allows the raters to have an alignment or consistency in how they are evaluating the candidate. One of the early problems in assessment centers was something they called inter-rater reliability, which meant that the raters who were observing behavior and taking notes had variability in the ratings that they assigned for the same behavior. So you could have an observer that wasn't very well trained, or several observers that weren't very well trained. They were given this rating sheet and they filled it out, and one person would say the person's a 4, another one would say the person's a 2. And so that's an example of inter-rater unreliability. So having the behavioral anchored rating scales allows the interviewers to look at what am I looking for when I ask these questions about initiative, and how will I know if the person is displaying the right level of initiative that we're looking for in this job. So the one-on-one interview helps get more objective, unbiased collection of data, and you're getting it in 3 different data points. And then when the interviewers sit down, they can discuss among them with a facilitator, what did you hear? How would you rate that? And how do you think that relates to predicting success on the job? And that's really the secret of the structured interview. It's the interplay of 3 different trained interviewers, all interviewing for similar things but asking different questions, and then being able to get together and share the information. And from that kind of sharing, they develop a consensus of what the overall score is for that person. That consensus translates to the word alignment, and the alignment gives the hiring managers the confidence that yes, we are selecting the right person. We have found the right things. We set out to find these things. We found them. We now have confidence that this person can do the job. Now, of course, what happens is I mentioned initiative as being one of the competencies that would be looked at, but remembering there are probably at least 8 of those. So what's going to happen over the entire interview is that some of those competencies are going to be rated as very high, and some of those competencies are not going to be rated as very high. So one of the challenges is when you get the interviewers back together again, you may have a consensus of opinion that this candidate is not very strong in this competency called planning and organizing, let's say. So then the decision rests among the interviewers. Okay, the person has 6 of the 7 or 6 of the 8 competencies that we're looking for. They are quite strong in those areas. These other 2, they're not quite so strong in. So what do we do about that? Do we reject the candidate because they're not quite up to our expectations on those? Or is that the kind of thing, can planning and organizing be easily trained? In other words, if we hired the person and we said right off the bat, okay, Mary, we're going to hire you. One thing we'd like to do is have you attend a seminar on planning and organizing because we think that's going to help you. It's one of the areas that we thought you perhaps needed some help in. So one of the things we're going to do with you in the orientation is we're going to take advantages of the strengths that you have, and we're very confident in those, but the strengths that you don't have, where we're not too sure of, we want you to participate in some training. Now, there's no bad news when you tell the person is hired, but you're also honing in on or focusing on what that person's development needs are. In my experience, when I've seen that played out in an organization where that kind of feedback, that balanced feedback is given to a candidate, they tend to take that feedback as not criticism, but as care, concern. And they feel better about the job offer. They say, well, look, they don't think I'm perfect, but they think I'm capable of doing the job. And with a little bit of training, they think I can do the whole job. So I'm pretty confident in accepting this job. So I think that's one of the big benefits of using the competencies is we're not expecting every candidate to be perfect in every one of the competencies. There may be one or two of the competencies that they're not quite where we would hope they would be. And but that gives us the opportunity to say, yeah, I think we can address this and we can still hire the person. And I think that removes the pressure of saying, well, we've got to find somebody perfect. Because if you try to find somebody perfect, you're likely to keep going and going and going. And oftentimes, the thing I hear back from people is that the interviewers are expecting to find perfection. And when they don't find perfection, they turn back to human resources and they say, hey, you guys need to provide us better candidates because we're not finding Mr. Perfect or Mrs. Perfect. We haven't found them yet. Well, you want to find somebody who's very, very close to meeting your specifications and see if you can help them with a little bit of training or coaching to come up to the level that you want. And I think that's one of the great values of the structured interview.
I totally agree.
Yeah. So, the other thing is that the feedback to the candidate from a structured interview really starts the onboarding process. So when we talk about structured interviews, we have learned an awful lot about the candidate that we've interviewed. An awful lot. We have a high degree of confidence that our prediction about their success and their competencies is pretty strong. And so the confidence in giving the person feedback is pretty strong as well. So as a result of our sharing that with the candidates, we find that candidates generally are more motivated and tend to be very optimistic about their own future with the organization.
I think this is a very important point. Based on my experience with lots of Chinese organizations, I have to say no one, not a single organization does that. And they spend
Uh-huh.
a lot of money, manpower to interview people, to test people. Finally, they select the candidate for the position, but they never tell the candidate why they were chosen and what their strengths is and weaknesses are, how they can address these weaknesses, and they never feed it back to the job candidate who are finally select for the job. So that usually put the candidate at a loss because they don't know how they were selected, what area they need to work on. I think it's just a waste of a good opportunity to have a positive impact for new employees.
I couldn't agree more, and I think you're absolutely right. It is. I mean, if you design the selection process as well as we've talked about, and obviously, we haven't talked about how you include personality or cognitive ability, or we haven't even talked about the reference checks yet. But the point is, you spent a lot of time, effort, and energy collecting a lot of very useful information about the candidate's development up to this point. And if we don't share that with the new hire, if that's the person we're going to hire, then it's a kind of a wasted effort. We have something very valuable to them that we're not sharing with them.
Yeah, the information is not utilized to its full extent. Let's speak that way.
Right, right. Okay. So the other things, I'm going to deviate a little bit from the competencies and just talk about the selection process itself. Once the decision is made that the person has kind of passed the first hurdle and said, okay, we think this person has got most of the competencies that we need to have them succeed in the job. We've agreed that there are one or two things that we want to include in their orientation program that involve training or coaching. The other things we have to check to match up on are is our salary offer going to be consistent with what the person is either expecting or now making? So, one of the things we also talk about and we'll talk about in more depth later, is the screening interview. So sometimes people ask me, say, "Well, Tom, what is the role of the screening interview, and when?" I mean, obviously, it happens in the beginning, but who does that? Is that the line manager's organization? Is it HR? And we always tell people, look, HR can do that because what they're trying to do is to find candidates that they want to bring in to have them meet with the hiring manager and the hiring manager's team. So that's the proverbial short list of candidates. So the screening interview still uses the competencies, but they also use a few other things like salary expectations. So you can make sure that when the screening interview goes on, there may be one or two competency questions that they ask, but then they also ask about salary expectations, and they also ask about work orientation factors. I remember years ago, was hiring people to come in to be finance people, but their first assignment was going to be working in a manufacturing plant as a cost analyst. And we never explained to them that they had everybody who worked in the plant had to wear a uniform. So you got a pair of blue slacks and a striped shirt that had the company name on it and the person's name on it because they wanted everybody in the plant to look the same. And some of the people said, "Look, I graduated from university. I'm a college graduate. I get in my car to go to work every morning, and people think I work in a factory." Well, yes, you do work in a factory, but you're not a factory worker. You're a cost analyst. So we found that there are people, because we hadn't explained that to people in the screening interview, that they would, if they were hired, they were going to be working as a cost analyst in a manufacturing plant, not on the plant floor. They were going to be working on the second floor in an air conditioned office with the rest of the finance team. But one of the requirements of working in a plant is that everybody walks through the plant door wears a uniform. So these are things that need to get conveyed in the process of the screening interview because it may be a very strong objection to the prospective employee, or maybe it helps them overcome that objection because it's not a shock, it's not a surprise. Make sense? Okay. All right. Very good. And the other thing we always say about screening interviews is that we're not trying to weed people out. We're trying to select people in. And people ask me all the time, well, what's the difference? I said, well, there's a big difference. We're not trying to, we start with nobody in the queue. We're screening people and we're looking for, this is a person I want to bring in and have the hiring manager meet. This is a person I want to bring in and have the hiring manager meet. And that's the mindset that we want to get across in the screening interview. So HR can still do that. But after HR does the screening, then they leave the rest of the process, the hiring decision, to the hiring manager and the hiring manager's team, because they're the people who own that candidate. So we want to make sure that the hiring manager is heavily involved in making the decision at the end. Now, when they make the decision at the end, they're still going to have to consult with HR on the starting date and the orientation schedule and make sure the salary offer is right and all of that. But so the screening interview is a part of the structured interview process. It happens at the front end, happens with HR, and HR builds that screening interview off of all the work that went into the job analysis process. So it's one piece of the puzzle, if you will.
I agree.
Okay. All right. Anything else you want to say about the structured interviews?
I do want to add an important point here.
Yeah.
We kind of talk about in the past is um, for the hiring managers to be able to interview job candidates, they need to receive the training on how to conduct behavior interviews.
Absolutely.
That's my point. Another point is it's somewhat counterintuitive, but we recommend based on our experience that it might be a good idea to have high potential people who you're going to eventually select or promote to managerial positions, have them involved in the interview process as early as possible so that they can see how this organization select people, what they are looking for. This will help them to further develop their competencies faster.
That's an excellent point, Fan. And we constantly tell people that the best introduction to management program you can give to somebody, if you think you have an individual contributor and you think that they have the potential to be a supervisor or manager someday, very first thing to do, to your point, is get them involved in interviewing training. Why? Because they learn how to look for what to look for, number one, and number two, how to evaluate it, which is a key skill they're going to have if they become a supervisor or manager. They have to know what to look for in terms of performance with anybody who's working in their organization, and they have to be able to assess what level that is and where the shortfall is, if there is a shortfall. And they also have to give some thought to how would I help this person develop that competency if that's something that they are not quite up to the level we thought they were going to be. Those are all excellent points, and I agree with you totally that there's a lot of opportunity. We collect a lot of information in the interviewing process. One other thing we didn't talk about, I'm just going to mention briefly. Sometimes people ask us, because we do have these big five personality questionnaires, when you use those in the process. And I always tell people you do it after the screening. Once you decide who you're going to bring in, you ask those short list of people to take the big five personality questionnaire. And that should be looked at in advance of the interviews. Because if you see some area where the person perhaps has a very low level of empathy, or they're not very strong in teamwork and collaboration, that gives us the chance during the interview to say, okay, let's make sure we ask questions about their experience with teamwork or collaboration, or where they've had to express empathy. Oftentimes, even though the personality doesn't show that they have teamwork or collaboration or empathy, for instance, they have learned in previous jobs that they have to demonstrate certain behaviors to be effective, and they may have already addressed that through training, even though it's not a part of their personality, because personality does not always predict behavior. Behavior is something we learn through experience and training.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Well, thanks, Fan, very much. I appreciate it as always. We always have great discussions.
My
And
pleasure.
thank you very much. So we will look forward to sharing information on future episodes.
Okay. Sounds great.
Thank you.